Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, and I'm sitting very close to you to two amazing scholars at George Mason, who are affiliated with the program for Middle East and Islamic Studies. This is the Middle East and Islamic Studies podcast, and as some of you may know, we have had several today and about a dozen iteration prior to today where we showcased the work of our faculty, as well as held panels and lectures that we shared with you. And this will continue. The podcast is a creature of COVID 19, the COVID 19 period, and it gave us an opportunity to connect actually with more people than ever before, albeit virtually. I am very pleased today to be joined by Professor Hatim El Hibri and Professor Eric McGlinchy here in our studio, and we will be asking them the same questions we have been asking our faculty relating to their research and teaching as well as activities. So, welcome, Hatim and Eric.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
If you are uncomfortable with the proximity, there's really very little we can do. So, just so you know. All right. So, I would like to start with Hatim, since you are wearing a black shirt. Um, I would like to ask you, Hatim, somebody who actually relatively recently joined, if you can share with us a little bit about your research and perhaps the trajectory, but also what you plan for in terms of future projects. And I have to say that your book just came out a few days ago or a few weeks ago. So you can also tell us about this. So each of us will have about, or each of you will have about 5 to 6 minutes, and then we will do the teaching round, and then we'll kind of open up a little bit.
Thanks so much, Bassam. Yeah, the book just came out a couple of days ago. It's now available anywhere that you buy books. So I come from a media studies background, and my appointment here at George Mason is in film and media studies. So here I'm housed in a humanities department. The job that I had before this was at the American University of Beirut, where I was in a social science department. So media studies is kind of an interdisciplinary beast by nature. And my own sort of focus on media, visual culture, urban studies, technology, media history, sort of straddles both of those sides. So my first book is called Visions of Beirut, The Urban Life of Media Infrastructure. To give you sort of a sense of the kind of research I do, the idea for this book started in 2006, where I went back to visit family in Beirut, the way many people do. It was the end of my first semester of PhD school, and there was a large sit-in demonstration in downtown Beirut, Solidaire, sort of the highly polished and manicured neoliberal urban city center. And Hezbollah's protest completely shut down the city. And walking around visiting it to see what was going on, I noticed that, first of all, the entire space had been totally transformed from like this very tightly policed and manicured space. It had become almost carnivalesque, right? People smoking shisha in the street, street sellers selling food and coffee in the way that you never would normally have. So when I was there, I noticed that there were not just those changes to the space, but also like these large projection screens onto which was being projected Al Manar, the Hezbollah TV channel. And so I noticed that at certain key moments, it was a live feed, and you had live at the protest coverage of the protest, right? So there's a circularity to that kind of image. Now, that sort of was for me the jumping off point. What is the situation that produces that specific visual circuitry? And what is the historical context which led to that particular geopolitical conflict? How have images, and increasingly live images, been bound up in the politics of the city? How have images been important to different governmental regimes trying to plan, map, shape, and surveil the city? But also, how have images been important to a range of political formations, including things like live TV broadcasts during, say, wars as well as protests? So that's sort of where the book comes from, right? It's at the nexus of urban studies, critical theoretical investigations into infrastructure. I'm very interested in how the infrastructures which move images become an indelible part of the visual culture of a particular moment. Um, so each chapter in the book looks at a different set of images, beginning sort of with like a very historically archival uh, orientation, looking at sort of maps going back to the French Mandate. Then there's a chapter on images in post-war construction, images of before, after, and how they animate the political economy of that moment. And then there's a chapter on the 2006 war and modalities of concealment. People think about infrastructure often in terms of how infrastructures work when they're on and when they function. But there's also a degree of incompleteness to all infrastructure. It doesn't just require repair all the time, but there's also ways of being in relation to infrastructure that are antagonistic. So concealment is a way of hiding from visibility rather than contesting it or operationalizing it in the form of surveillance or spectacle. So the final concluding chapter of the book looks at the Mlita Museum of the Resistance to show what happens when concealment becomes turned into a tourist exhibit, and to sort of comment on the foreclosure of political horizons in Lebanon. I hope that doesn't go for too long. Oh, I have more time. Yeah, so like this book, it draws from and wants to contribute to urban studies, to discussions of critical cartography, to film theory, to TV studies, as well as to core debates around what is the nature of sectarianism and how can we think it through in terms of its infrastructural relations. Media studies overlaps with urban studies, overlaps with a range of other disciplines. Part of what I want to do, though, is to say that the situations and conditions that obtain in the Middle East, and particularly a place like Lebanon, has a great deal of insight to offer to not just, it has a great deal to offer to a range of other disciplines, maybe not just for Middle East experts. The Middle East is the place from which I try to think about media.
Thank you. Thanks, Hatim. Although I know quite a bit of this, I enjoyed listening to it again. And as I've shared with the other colleagues that I have hosted, everything that's happening in the MEIS podcast is causing me to realize that we really do need to hold an internal workshop here at George Mason on pedagogy among faculty who work on the region, because we do this all over the world. As you know, we host people from everywhere, but the wealth of knowledge and production that we have at George Mason really merits a bit more focus. And I'm guilty of not focusing more, even though we've invited you, as you both know, to a number of events in the past. So we will do more of this. Eric, if you can shed some light on your own research, if you don't mind, you have about 6 to 7 minutes.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Bassam and Hatam. It was wonderful listening about to your research. It's inspiring. So I guess what I'll do is I'll first talk about my first research project, my first book, Chaos, Violence, and Dynasty, Islam Politics in Central Asia. And then I'll move on to my current research. I guess I should begin with a confession in that I started researching Central Asia in part because I was bored with what I was currently researching, which was Russia. Russia was very predictable, whereas Central Asia in the early 2000s was less predictable. And then also in part because I like to climb, and the climbing in Central Asia is just a lot better than the climbing in Russia. I apologize to my Russian friends, but the rock in Central Asia is just a lot better. After college in the late 90s, I had this kind of idiosyncratic grant called the Watson Fellowship, which allowed me to travel around. And I got on a train in Moscow, and I went to the one place in the former Soviet Union that had huge mountains, and that was Central Asia. So 5 days later, I found myself in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And I kept going back year after year after year. And the first project just kind of emerged almost organically after having spent time in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. I tried to do work in Turkmenistan, but I got kicked out of Turkmenistan. So it was really those four countries. And I noticed that my experience living in these four countries was very different. I was kind of comfortable living in Kyrgyzstan. I could do whatever I wanted. No one ever really bothered me, but it was a really poor country. Kazakhstan, I always felt like there's more people watching me, that the state was more present, but it was much wealthier. So I could go and I could get my gourmet coffee and my ice cream from Baskin Robbins. Uh, Uzbekistan was odd, and I actually was thrown in jail in Uzbekistan. And so it was this lived experience that led me to this question. Well, why are these authoritarian regimes, they're all authoritarian, but why are they so different, right? Why is Kyrgyzstan, a country that had, well, by now, gosh, I think there's been five different rulers since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why was politics so chaotic, right? So that's the chaos of Chaos, Violence, and Dynasty, my first book. Why was Uzbekistan, the place that threw me in jail, why was this place so violent? And just as a sidebar, I should note that one of my research colleagues in the mid 2000s was gunned down in the streets of Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek on the border with Uzbekistan, because he was printing a newspaper that was critical of the Uzbek government. So this was the violence of the Chaos, Violence, Dynasty project. And then Kazakhstan, this was a country that was incredibly stable, but was facing a challenge that I think is not dissimilar to what students in the Middle East see with many of their regimes. How do you continue an autocratic government when the leader is aging out, right? So the leader was getting older and older. So it was this challenge of dynastic politics. And so that was the first project. And I was trying to explain this variation. Why do we have three such different governments? And ultimately, the argument came down to one, institutions. So in the case of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, these countries more or less inherited the old Soviet party. And if you're a member of the old Soviet party, there's thousands and thousands of other members. And if you say to yourself, well, if I want to overthrow the government, what is the likelihood of whomever I support actually having me in his next ruling coalition? And it's quite small because there's literally thousands of people the new autocrat could choose from. What that does is it makes you loyal to the current autocrat, right? This is probably a logic that many students of the Middle East understand well. Conversely, Kyrgyzstan, the Communist Party collapsed, and that's a whole different story for why it collapsed in the early 90s, but it collapsed, and there was a very narrow political elite that emerged as a result of this collapse. 20, 30, 40, 50 people, at least initially, and maybe expanded slowly out from there. But there, the likelihood of being in the next autocratic government is actually quite high, right? So if you band together with others to overthrow the despot, you have a pretty good chance of being in the next government. And that explained in part the dynamic that we saw and the variation, the chaos of Kyrgyzstan. The difference between the violence and the dynastic elements of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, I attribute in large part to resources. Kazakhstan has the largest oil find in the last 20 years. This has enabled the government more or less to pay everybody off and keep the elite pretty content. Uzbekistan has less resources, and on top of that, has seen much more Islamic, not Islamist, but Islamic revival, and the largely secular autocratic state has perceived this as a challenge to its rule. So that's the violence aspect of Chaos, Violence, Dynasty. The Uzbek government has been violently repressing the challenges it perceives from Islam. I think these are somewhat manufactured challenges, but nonetheless, this is where the violence came in. So that was the first project. And if I have a little bit of time, I can talk a bit about the next project. So the next project that I'm working on is really at the intersection of international relations and comparative politics. So whereas the first project was very firmly in what we would call comparative politics, the study of politics within countries, my next project is really at this intersection. And so here I'm looking at Central Asian receptivity to what, for a lack of a better term, we'll call the great powers, China, Russia, the United States, and also for their side, the US, Russian, and Chinese attempts to exert power in the region. And currently I've got 3 different papers on this topic. And the first one that I'm working on right now is exploring a border conflict that just happened in April between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And in part, this is a conflict over things that, again, won't be unfamiliar to people who study the Middle East, scarce water supplies. And this is a water facility that rests on disputed territory between the two countries. So there's a bit of a kind of a cross-border dynamic, but also it's in part motivated by the fact that Tajikistan feels newly emboldened by its relationships with Russia. There's a much greater Russian investment in the military presence in Tajikistan. And so I think Tajikistan may feel that it can do things that it couldn't do before it had this potentially greater Russian backstop. So that's where the international relations dimension comes in. So that's the first paper. The second paper, and one that I've actually been working on with a lot of Mason students, is Central Asian receptivity to LGBTQ plus rights. This is something that under the Obama administration was heavily pushed throughout the region and actually internationally heavily pushed. And has largely been pushed back upon by Central Asian populations. So the receptivity to this U.S. agenda has been minimal, and moreover, this is something that other powers, particularly Moscow, has seized upon as a wedge issue to try to move Central Asia away from the United States. So it's really looking at this intersection of what Russia is trying to do in Central Asia around LGBTQ plus, using it instrumentally, what the United States is trying to do, largely, I would say, from a human rights-based perspective, and then how Central Asians respond to the U.S. potential overreach on this issue. And it also explores the very real struggles that the embattled LGBTQ plus community in Central Asia is waging on a daily basis to protect their basic rights. So that's the second piece that I'm working on. And then the last piece I'm looking at is exploring how China is perceived in Central Asia. And China's been interesting. I'd actually be curious to hear your perspective on this. But China has been very careful politically not to kind of take sides in this Russia-US battle, but to really just focus on the economic component, trying to build up the economics of the region and stay politically neutral and trying to extend its power this way. So here what we're doing is we're looking at some survey data. We're trying to run surveys in Central Asia. We're actually having trouble because we can't get in right now because of COVID. The vaccination rate in Kyrgyzstan, for example, is 0.4%. So we can't physically get in to conduct the surveys, but hopefully we'll get some sense of Central Asian receptivity to China and get a better understanding of how Central Asians perceive the economic investments, the potential debt traps associated with engagement with China.
Wow, this is wonderful. Thank you. This has been actually very insightful on both of your parts, and there are many things I'd like to talk about and ask. And it's okay if we go a little bit over time, a little bit, because you both made the trip here. You had to drive, and you had to like pollute the environment, and so we could talk a little bit about China, maybe just a minute. I'll just say something very straightforward, which is very. I mean, you said you'd like to hear our views, and I'm assuming I was one of the people you mentioned.
Of course, yeah.
And then please feel free to do your part, Hatim. But you also said what I was gonna say, which is basically that China is being extremely careful politically, like in the recent, for instance, bombardment of Gaza, in the question that have to do with Egypt, the question that have to do with the Syrian uprising and the mayhem that took place over there. It's extremely careful not to lose connections and not to lose relations because it's primarily interested, frankly, in exploiting, you know, areas and markets for economic reasons, right? I mean, it just doesn't want anything to get in the way, and I think, of course, this is temporary. It's not going to always be the case. It's going to actually end up having to become political like any other power, or more political, because obviously we're trying to depoliticize too much, and I don't mean to do that. Obviously it is political. Everything is politics, but it hasn't been as explicitly political to the extent that its power allows it, for the same reason. I don't know if Hatim has.
Yeah, I mean, a part of how I know a little bit about this is people who will discuss the tech industry
Right.
and its longstanding relationship with China, not just in terms of Chinese tech manufacturing, but also increasingly China's investments in transportation and digital infrastructures. Um, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to think about or have you worked through sort of not just Chinese media systems, but sort of Chinese tech and tech platforms in Central Asia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. One of the things that I would love to study, I don't have the bandwidth at this point to use a tech term, is CCTV, right? So if you look at the and again, I think this is another point of intersection with the Middle East. But if you look at how, in a kind of a Foucauldian kind of way, the state is trying to monitor and police its population, it's increasingly through cameras, right, and facial recognition. All that technology is coming from China, right? It's almost universally coming from China. It's a topic. I'm not quite sure what the research question is. It's certainly something that keeps us all up at night. The thing that we're most trying to do at this point, and this is where we're a little bit stuck, is we're trying to assess the causal effect of framing from these different platforms. Like, so the Russian framing through things like Sputnik, US framing through things like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and then Chinese framing through some of their support of both Chinese media in Central Asia, but also support of the local media. And that's really hard to assess. And they were trying to run some experiments. So not so much the platforms, but just the framing effects coming from different media platforms. Does Chinese or Russian stuff resonate more than something that's tagged with Voice of America?
Thank you. That's actually pretty cool. I kind of want to go off track and talk about other things other than featuring your scholarship and teaching, but we have to come back to that. But you know what? I mean, since this is, I promised everyone, and we at the Middle East Islamic Studies program also shared that this is going to be conversational and casual. So I'll say the following. Uh, I really would like to have these sessions more focused on topical matters. And since we're very close to Mason,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully people will be able to come and join us, and we'll have even a better setting where we're not almost sitting on each other's laps because it's COVID and but we're all vaxxed, I'm assuming.
You want us to be able to sit around coffee table style rather than newscast
Yeah,
style.
just a little bit, a little bit more space so people can come to. So let's move to the question of teaching. So I'm sorry to cut this discussion, although this is what I'd really like to also talk about. But let's talk about teaching. If you can tell us what courses you're teaching and why should people consider coming to George Mason to teach, or what should people at George Mason consider taking your classes. One of the problems in a big school like George Mason is that we don't know all the resources that are available to us, and that's kind of sad. And I know that there is an effort to actually sort of make people privy of this spectrum of offerings, but it's just never enough. So if you can share that with us, I'll be really appreciative, and then Eric can address that. So the classes you're teaching, the courses you're teaching, what you plan to teach, and whether it's been affected by the wave of mobilization for social justice on the questions of race, gender, class, and so on.
Sure. So, I mean, I teach between film and media studies and Middle East and Islamic studies. But there's a little bit of the Middle East in even just in like my intro to TV studies class, which I teach. But then I also teach classes which are like formally focused on the Middle East, like a survey course which I'll be teaching in the spring on film and media of the Middle East. I also will teach graduate classes from time to time. I'm now going to be teaching a class on global media industries and television for the Cultural Studies PhD program. Of course, talented MEIS students would be more than welcome to sit in there. So media studies and the Middle East one can be used to illuminate the other, right? There are methods, theoretical approaches, conceptual frameworks from media studies which are useful to people who just want to think about society and culture in complex ways, right? What does it mean to think about media, not just in terms of its effects on the imaginary or its ability to articulate political perspectives, but to also think about it in terms of its relationship to state power. What are the ways that one might think about transformations in, like, say, distribution technology on the TV industry, and how that creates space or closes down spaces for contestation of, like, mainstream public discourses. So there's all of my classes grapple with these questions. Now, when I teach film and media of the Middle East, it takes a much more humanistic perspective. How is film as a artistic object a venue through which to think about the Middle East in a range of ways, including the issues, like the very important issues that you were just mentioning, movements for social justice, queer perspectives, feminist perspectives, and so on.
And that's despite the fact that we don't have problems of human rights in the region.
There's no problems with human rights. There are no. It's all a Western plot. There are no queer people. Feminism has never existed in the region. Now, obviously, it's not the case. Although the articulations that they take, what the specific priorities and sensibilities, uh, the vernacular languages that they speak do work differently than, say, in the U.S. And so this is where students who aren't like necessarily just interested in the Middle East as a topic actually, that in the classes that I've taught in the past, are like, wow, this is like such an interesting way just to think about film, to watch, say, feminist film from Tunisia, or to think about TV from Iran, right? These are things which are interesting not just because of their topicality, but they they speak to a range of intellectual concerns. You learn a new way to think about society as well as how to think about the interpretation of film texts. Thinking about aesthetics is a compelling way to think about politics. Um, so these are the things which at least I emphasize, and these sort of uh, critical theoretical, feminist, uh, critical ethnic and racial studies. All of these things have always been in dialogue with media studies, but when you look at the fractures that run through the Middle East, you come to learn very different things about uh, empire, politics, violence, war, militarist intensification,
Actually,
religion, and
actually, this is yeah, that's very interesting, and I should say we should disclose that we both co-taught a course on film, text, and the Arab uprisings, and it was a really remarkable experience because I got uh, those of us who teach politics and economy, political science, address things in a certain way, and then when I taught with Hatim and the way when he started lecturing, I'm like, what is he talking about? What where's the politics? It was really awesome. I mean, I'm exaggerating. I really like knew that you were headed somewhere that is extremely meaningful and political, but the approach was so different. It was such an enlightening course, and I actually had to borrow or did borrow quite a few of the approaches that you produced in that classroom. So thank you for that, and we'll come back in the last round to ask you about activities and things of the sort. But before that, before I even go to Eric, I just want to tell Eric that since you and I have been teaching for at the same place for almost 14 years or so, um, we've never co-taught a class. And you
Mm,
teach a class on authoritarianism, I teach a class on authoritarianism. It would be awesome if we do something that is more broadly sort of the global south, authoritarianism, the global
mm,
south, and if we're just lucky enough, we can just teach a class on authoritarianism because authoritarianism has kind of come to the West in ways that
indeed.
are I mean, with the rise of certain movements and the constraining of politics, I mean, we might not have to even have these boundaries or even blur them.
Yes, yes.
So if you can share with us I know that by the way, with your students and your students, I know for a fact because they come to me, they really enjoy your classes,
Mm,
both of you, and I really appreciate the sort of expansion of horizons that they experience. Students at the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies program, when they come out of your classes, they've shared that, and I'm speaking very candidly, so I really appreciate that. So if you can share with us a little bit about your teaching
sure. Well,
experiences.
for the feedback. I'm glad that the students in the MEIS program
Oh yeah.
find it helpful. I find their presence in the class to be incredibly helpful because it expands. I'm comfortable in Central Asia, but I'm cognizant of the fact that authoritarianism exists outside of Central Asia, in Middle East. But as you were just saying, here in the United States, and for the first time this semester, I framed my class on authoritarianism using a book about the United States. So one of the leading texts that we used for this past semester was Norris and Englehart's book on authoritarian populism here in the United States, as U.S. and Europe. Um, and it's funny because you referenced the global South, and that used to be kind of my perspective, right? Authoritarianism was something that existed elsewhere, but we now see that it's here within our own society, and this kind of authoritarian populist wave that we may have initially pegged starting in Eastern Europe, is very much present in the United States, and it's now traveling from the United States to places like Central Asia. So that the Trumpian model is a model that I now see in Central Asia.
Or
So,
Turkey.
yeah, exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. So back to the initial remit of your question. Teaching, I teach a class on comparative authoritarianism, And your point about feminism and LGBTQ plus BLM, that is something that I have to say that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think I paid sufficient attention to. Um, Thanks to the feedback from students from MEIS, but also broadly within the university, I've begun to change that and just become more aware of my own kind of position as a translator of Central Asia and authoritarianism to our own audience here in DC. And I'm increasingly aware that I, as someone with a last name of McGlinchy, and looking the way I do, provide a degree of legibility to a local population that someone from Central Asia herself or himself might not. I'm kind of like a translator, and I'm somewhat uncomfortable with that role as a translator. And so more and more, what I'm trying to do when I'm teaching comparative authoritarianism, or when I'm speaking to a population here in DC, is to bring those voices directly into the conversation and no longer situating myself as a translator and interpreter of Central Asia, but highlighting the scholarship from the region, and letting that scholarship speak for itself. So more and more in my classes, I'm trying to bring scholarship from Central Asian scholars or Middle East scholars or Africa scholars, who can directly speak to the experience, both theoretical and lived experience of authoritarianism in their countries. So I think that's one fundamental way in which I've changed the way I teach this course. The other courses I teach, so I teach a course on Central Asian politics, which is my area of expertise, and a number of students are fascinated with the intersection, for example, of Iran and Tajikistan. Sometimes they anticipate there should be much more of an intersection than there actually is, given the shared language. And sometimes students are surprised to see the degree of interaction between, say, Iran and Uzbekistan that don't share that common language, right? So that has, I think, been a draw for students from the MEIS program. But I also teach Central Asia not from the view of the Middle East, the greater Middle East, but also from the post-Soviet colonial view, right? So there's I think it's a region which defies boundaries, and I realize that we have to have programs, and so Middle East has to, we have an imagining what the Middle East is, we have an imagining what Central Asia is, but when you speak to people from Central Asia, I don't think that they conceive of their boundaries in the same way that you or I may conceive of their boundaries. It's much more fluid, and the interactions are much more frequent than we might anticipate. So that's, of course, in Central Asian politics. And then the other area where I've had a lot of students from the MEIS program has been my research design course, Government 500. So I've had a number of students who have decided that they want to they want to explore different approaches to research. So a positivist research approach, which is one that I certainly teach in Government 500, but also get a better understanding of critiques, maybe postmodern critiques, anthropological critiques of this postmodernist approach. So this course, although it's not Middle East, Central Asia, or authoritarianism or religion focused, it's much more research design focused. I think it helps give students the tools they need, and kind of a buffet of different methodologies they can use in doing research on the greater Middle East.
Thank you. Actually, can I ask you a question while we are on topic? Always been struck by what people know little about, which, by the way, does include the Middle East. People in the United States, my students, like newer students, not newer as in like younger students, uh, they know little about how countries in the Arab world, for instance, operate, what they're about. But and then I'm sure they know even less about Central Asia, but they think they know about the Middle East and the Arab world because of the way we portray the Middle East and the Arab world, and because of the connections, right? The political and otherwise. But it seems to me that with Central Asia, people know little about how they operate. And by the way, even people in the Middle East know very little about how Central Asia. I mean, maybe this is global. I don't want to make that, claim yet. I don't know enough, but people not only know little, but they also know that they know little about Central Asia. So it's great that you're offering this. I just wonder why is this the case, given that Central Asia was dominated by the other superpower that the United States had a Cold War with, and it just seems to me that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's very little public knowledge about how Central Asia works beyond the tropes.
Yeah.
Is that an incorrect assumption?
Well, but Bassam, you can learn everything you need to know about Central Asia from watching Borat, right? And now we've had two installments of it, right? So we've had two chances to. Um,
I haven't finished the second one yet because the people I was watching this said I cannot do this.
yeah,
We have to stop.
yeah. No, I mean the funny thing about Borat is, and this is actually how Central Asians in part got to understand the United States. This wasn't a show about Central Asia; it was, of course, a show about the United States. And then Kazakhstan slowly came to realize that, which was good. Why do we know so little about Central Asia? I think in part you gave an answer, right? It was subsumed within our understanding of the Soviet Union, and frankly, it wasn't just Central Asia. If you ask people about Ukraine, right? Ukraine was just elided with the Soviet Union, and given this name of Russia, right? I mean, this is greater Russia, so we all kind of put it in that lump, and it was really only in after September 11th that people began to pay attention, and regrettably for bad reasons, right? The what happened, I think, after September 11th is people said, "Oh, what's around Afghanistan?" There's this place called Central Asia. Who lives in Central Asia? They're majority Muslim countries. Ergo, it must be a hub of Islamist terror, and that's how, at least within this town, people got to know Central Asia. So for my first 5 years at Mason, my sole mission was just to disabuse people of this perception that Muslim majority means Islamist threat. And I'm sure you've had to do the same thing in your own research. It was just constant, and frankly, it just got tiring after a while. And I'm glad to a certain extent we've moved beyond that. But that regrettably, I think, is how many people came to learn about Central Asia.
Thank you. We have maybe like one more step in our case, or at least in my case, teaching the Middle East or teaching the Arab world, which is not only do you have to disabuse people of things that they thought they knew, but you, you have to work so hard to help people along in unlearning things that they are super convinced about because of the repeated portrayal about the Middle East or the Arab world. Because in the case of Central Asia, we don't have that sort of constant barrage. So I'm sure they're both difficult tasks. Can you tell us a
I
little bit
mean,
about this, about the unlearning process in your field, or anything
so
else you want to say?
so yeah, I mean, unlearning actually takes certainly the form that you're describing, disabusing people who know very little about the region or have very little personal connection of, sort of very flat one-dimensional impressions framed through terrorism or whatever else, underdevelopment or whatever the frame is. On the other side of it, though, you also have people who are familiar with the region, are maybe from there, or perhaps their family is originally from there, they're first or second generation, and are super convinced they know exactly what Egypt is about. And it becomes there's a different.
That's because they fast
Well,
Ramadan, right?
it's not even because of those sorts of associations. It's they've had to be in the position of having to explain why it isn't all a hotbed of Islamist terrorism. Um, so on the one hand, they've had to do that work of translation. On the other hand, like I'm saying, like they have their own set of baggage and their own sort of affective baggage relating to these places. So there's a different kind of work that you do, which is or that's important. And then classes like this are a place for people to work through these things. Almost always, in being able to work through them without those standard pressures, those limitations on these conversations, you give people space to think through things, and they end up with really rich perspectives coming out of it.
Thank you both very much. I would like to talk more about your teaching, but I want to talk about it about your activities, which could include teaching, in a different way, which is to ask you the same question I'm asking other colleagues of ours, which is if you can tell us a little bit about any activities that you actually carry not illicit, because we're live, outside the classroom, any activities that have to do with the realm of knowledge production, or even the realm of social justice. Because earlier someone shared their interest and their actual work on providing avenues for improving education in Gaza, for instance. which is not an strictly academic issue, but that's what they do. So if there's anything outside the realm of the classroom that you'd like to share in terms of activities, not least in relation to the context in which we find ourselves, where there is, frankly, a lot of receptivity to the role of the public intellectual, whereas before we were viewed as, just academics from the ivory tower. But now there's more receptivity to things that we might be what we might be saying or doing. So if you can just comment on this, you have a couple minutes each, and then we'll see how much more time we have before we have to wrap up.
I wish I was talented enough to also be a skilled organizer or filmmaker or photographer. Sadly, the one thing that I'm reasonably good at is critically oriented and informed research. I sort of have uh, arts communities and activist communities in mind in the work that I do. So right now that I have the pressure of the first book that is lifted, I now have this sort of abundance of new mental space. So I'm working on 3 different projects. One of which is a book project, which will be uh, a genealogy and media history of the notion of the Arab street and in different media historical eras and political situations. And it's a different way to think about the racializations through which we understand public space and political passions in the Arab world. There's another project that I'm working on that wants to rethink the 1990s as this era of major political, economic, and ideological transformation, and how thinking about media from the global south, this is a collaborative project that I'm working on, thinking about media from the global south can make us reframe what we now think of as the digital era. It will look at sort of how those transformations are very much with us in the historical present. And then there's another project which informs both of these, which is where I'm trying to think through a comparative mode of racialization in media. This will look at not just sort of, stereotypes are bad, but at the level of aesthetics, feeling, and narrative frameworks through which difference is felt.
That's wonderful, and that's actually the first project that you mentioned is so needed. The question of the Arab Street, because people speak of the Arab Street as though we know what the Arab Street is, and those who did know it in the 90s studied it think it's the same Arab Street, and those who knew it before the uprisings think that it's still. So this is really interesting, especially given the vertical chronology and the sort of maybe vertical comparative approach that looks historically at the development of what the Arab Street is. But I have to say, you said that you don't have these other times. But what about this bomb you threw at me right before the show? It's a discursive bomb. It's a discursive bomb. When Arabs say bomb in the United States, they have to explain. It's a discursive bomb, okay? Mafi bomb, no bomb, nothing. We're not gonna do anything. Chill. Um, when you told me that we should continue our work, and because we are also involved in a pedagogical project on films in the classroom,
Sure.
and you said something about a documentary. So you do have these interests and aspirations.
I co-conspire. I'm very adjacent to all of these things.
Okay, well, thanks, Hatim, for sharing. Eric, I'm sure you have tons of. I've been following you. I've been like our offices were next door, so I hear things and I know a lot about what you're doing. But please share with us.
Yeah, so the question is, what do we do outside of our research and classroom teaching? Yeah. So I feel fortunate to be able to engage the policy community, the broader policy community in DC, but also out in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, London, Tashkent. So that's the main way I try to contribute. And I have to say that, early on in my career, and this may be somewhat controversial, but early on in my career, uh, I was approached by the intelligence community, right? The U.S. intelligence community, and I mean like the State Department, Office of Intelligence and Research, but also the Department of Defense, intelligence analysts across the government. And I had a question: do you engage this community, or do you say by engaging it, I become influenced by this community? I mean, I realize that this is a really controversial question, particularly for anthropologists, maybe more for sociologists as well. But as a political scientist, I feel like I have the chance to engage this community, and if I'm honest and fully disclose it, I've got nothing to hide. So what I have done since I've arrived at Mason is wholeheartedly embrace these conversations, not necessarily the agenda of these communities themselves, but the conversation. So I regularly will talk to colleagues in the U.S. government. I will be briefing uh, colleagues in the UK Parliament later in the month. I have given presentations to colleagues in the Kyrgyz government, and so whenever I get the chance to share what my analysis is, I seize upon it. And then one thing that I'm really excited about is next year at the undergraduate level, not the graduate level. So that might be less relevant to the MEIS program, but at the undergraduate level, I'm starting what we're calling the International Policy Task Force, the IR Policy Task Force, where students will focus on one of three different problems. We're looking at the global response to COVID-19, LGBTQ plus rights and foreign policy, and then the challenges of global warming, and look at problems both at the international and the local level, devise policy responses, and then engage the policy community here in DC, be it the US government, IMF, World Bank, foreign embassies, and present their policy solutions. So my main activity outside of the classroom is trying to translate knowledge, academic knowledge, to a policy audience, but also to a broader audience in a way that it can be easily comprehended and I hope improve understanding.
That's very interesting, Eric. I mean, I have to also say that I have been also approached by government agencies to speak, and we grapple with that, right? And then you realize that if you can maintain your autonomy and independence, you could actually perhaps do some good, because you can speak truth to power, if you will, or you can just say it like it is, regardless of what's being expected, which is different for us as academics than for some, not all, but many, I guess, people in the policy world, whereby the more what you're saying comports with government,
Mm-hmm.
the more you're likely to be asked to come back, which is why our research on congressional testimonies from think tank personnel in the Knowledge Production Project, people can check it out at knowledgeproduction.com. There's a connections tab where you see how people circulate between academia, government, media, and think tanks. In the policy world, it's much more difficult to claim that I'm just going to go speak truth to power and maintain my autonomy, because there's this affinity. With us, it's a bit easier because you can do your thing and step out. You're not involved in the policy making. You're not involved in policy recommendations in a direct daily way. I mean, our work is research and teaching, but this is, in my view, and I don't know if you share this. I think this is something that should be brought to the fore, in the sense that it's good to have a conversation, like an actual conversation, a real conversation, a workshop on these questions of the relationship between intellectuals and government agencies and power, not just here, but in many other contexts. So you just that piqued my interest, and I feel it's good, instead of running away from it and say, oh no, I want to stay pure and so on, as if the people who are not engaged in this are necessarily doing something that is really positive for the world. It's not the case, but also engagement is something to
Yeah.
address, unpack, and talk about. So I think this is
If
fascinating.
I could just real quickly, but I just wanted to say for our listeners, our watchers, that I do recognize that this is a thorny issue,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because
No,
when you're funded, as I have been by the U.S. government, this affinity, this desire to, this potential impulse to come up with conclusions that support existing stances is there, right? So I don't want to pretend that we as academics are somehow
no, we're
free
not.
of this, right?
Absolutely not.
There's a whole cottage industry, as you guys know well, in the 2000s, where if you raise the flag of Islamist terror, you got funded, right?
Yeah.
So that risk is there, and I think although we should engage, right, we always have to be cognizant of that potential
Exactly.
risk. And I try to be. I can't say that I always am successful, but I at least try to be aware of
I
that.
don't think anybody is, and sometimes it's inadvertent. But I'm just interested in this question because people tend to not want to talk about it. So I appreciate you bringing it up and addressing it. And I think it's another good panel. My partner is gonna kill me because I already have a lot of projects, and now I have this idea of these different pedagogic and otherwise, other sorts of panels that I'd like to hold at George Mason. So I'll stop here. Would you seemed like you wanted to say something?
No, I think if you guys can find ways to make stupid happen less, by engage in any venue that you can, right? I mean, there's few things that break one's heart more than just unnecessary
Absolutely.
stupidity.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and it also depends on what area you're working in, right? I mean, it's different if you're like doing policy on area X versus area B, because the intensity is different, and the preconceived notions, or the amount of preconceived notions, right? It's not as ossified. So it also depends on what area. But this is all very interesting, and I kind of don't want to stop talking, but I know that you guys have to get back to your worlds and families, and I want to thank you profusely for not just joining me like everyone else did today. We had about half a dozen faculty members join in this marathon today, but also to you drove here, and I'm assuming you're gonna drive back, but you're welcome to stay if you like. So thank you, Hatim, and thanks, Eric. I hope you come back and feel free to come up with your own ideas so we can come here and actually use the space for whatever you see fit. I'll leave you with the last word if you have a last word. Otherwise, we'll just.
Just thanks for having us. It's great to see you in person after so long.
I know it's great. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's just lovely to actually do something with colleagues in person again.
Right?
Yeah, it's
Isn't it
wonderful.
cool?
It's great.
Oh my
Yes,
oh my
yes,
god.
I'm
Oh
really
my
looking
god.
forward.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I have to say, I'm looking forward to it more than ever
yeah,
because we haven't been able to do it,
yes,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Sometimes you go to your office and you kind of close the door so you can get some work done, and now it's like you open the door,
right,
just put your chair out there like we do in the region, and put some coffee,
right.
a coffee
Yes,
machine right
yes,
there, and say,
yeah,
"Come on in, let's have a chat."
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both for coming and for
Thank you.
joining.
Thanks.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
and we will be back with a lot more conversations after we conclude the discussion on faculty profiles. I think we're going to move even in more depth into more substantive and topical types of podcasts. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful week.